Hello, and welcome to the Wade Borth Podcast. I'm your host, Wade Borth, and in every episode, my goal is to get you to think differently about how money works and ultimately to empower you to take control of your money and your personal financing system. So, I've been asked a number of different times to explain the infinite banking concept to people, and it's actually a very simple concept, but our conditioned thinking kind of gets in our way of understanding what it really is and how to really understand it. So one of the simple ways that I've been able to explain it is a way that I explained to my son one day when we were walking down the streets of my little town that I live in. We don't have curb and gutter, we just have open ditches. And one time in the spring, as the water was melting and spring was coming, we were walking down the street out for a walk. We were taking our dog for a walk. And my son asked, he says, "Dad, what do you do?" And I said, well, I help people understand how to take control of the banking function in their life. And so in his curiosity as a young person, is like, well, what does that mean? Because he didn't have any preconceived notions of what that was. And I said, well, the best way to explain it is, I said, take a look at the water in the ditch. I said, money is like water. And I reference this back to Nelson Nash, Becoming Your Own Banker. He talks about one pool. Money's like water, and it's just, there's one pool. There's one pool of water in this world and there's one pool of money. But the point I was trying to get across to him was money, unlike what the banks tell you to do, money has to flow to be valuable. And so I said, look at the ditch. I said, look at the water that's flowing through the ditch. I said, think about when's it most powerful? When does it have its most energy? And he says, when it's flowing, Dad. He says, look at the end of the ditch down by our neighbors where it's cut the ditch into a valley because when the water flows, it takes the dirt away. It's got all the power. It's when it's flowing. And I said, yeah, and you can use it. And you can harness it. To his credit, he goes, well, it's like when it turns a water mill or when it turns a water wheel, it can produce electricity. I said, that's exactly right. That's when it has its most power. And I said, now take a look at that ditch behind her house, because there's a ditch behind her house that just stores water, holds water. And I said, what do you see there? He said, well, that's the ditch that becomes stagnant. That's the one that becomes green and ugly and stinks by the end of the summer. And by the end of the summer, it's pretty much gone. I said, well, that's kind of like water being stored. So that was the first step of he understanding how money works. When we just store our money, what's going to eat away at it? It's going to be inflation. It's going to be taxes. It's going to be in fees that go along with it. And eventually that money will dry up. Just like that pond in the back. When it's never flowing, it's going to dry up because of inflation, taxes, and fees. When it's in the ditch and it's flowing, that's when we see its real power. That's when we can harness it. If we have it at a hydroelectric dam or whatever it might be, that's the best example of when money flows. And we can look at what banks do. Well, let's take a look at what the current banking system does. If you walk into the bank and you got $1,000 and you put it in your savings account, does the bank actually put the money there? And this is the conversation I was having with him. I said, does the bank actually put it in the vault and say, okay, I'm going to store this money for you, Josh, until you need it? And he didn't quite understand that. And I said, well, there's a lot of what people think that banks do with the money. And I said, it's the exact opposite of that. What the banks will do is that they'll turn around and they put it to work. They start flowing the money, and that's where they make their revenue, and that's where they make their millions and billions of dollars, is by having money flow. They tell you, and they get you to believe that the best way to do it is to store your money with the bank or store your money with somebody else. But what they do in reality is that they turn around and they make their money flow. So the question is, why do we need the banks to make that happen? Why don't we cut them out? Or why don't we put ourselves in that same position of being the banker? Put ourselves in that position of making the money flow. If that's buying real estate, financing the stuff that we do to make wealth, or turn around and lending those dollars out. That's probably the easiest explanation I can use with somebody is like, look at nature and how things work. And when things are flowing, that's when they're fresh. That's when they have the real power. But when they sit and are being stored, that's when it stagnates. And big corporations and big banks understand that you don't want money to be stored for a long period of time without any purpose. Because if that's the case, it's going to, that money's going to stagnate, that money's going to evaporate, it's going to soak into the ground, and eventually the point where you have little or nothing to show for it. So what we want to do is we want to take control of the banking function and then have our money flow, and then that flowing of money, just like the flowing of the water down the ditch, is where we're going to generate real wealth. Or in water's case, it's going to generate electricity, it's going to generate power. We're going to generate wealth for the use of our money. And we want to make sure we're wise with it, we're smart with it, but yet we want to do like the big banks do. We want to do like nature does. We want it to have a flow. If you're enjoying this podcast or know anyone else that might be interested, please be sure to hit the subscribe button and please leave a review. This will help this podcast reach and help more people by ranking higher in searches and ultimately help more people get out of financial bondage. And don't be afraid to share this podcast with your friends and family, as we can be easily found on Apple Podcasts and Spotify.